Good morning. Just thought today that I would talk a little bit about, if you want, the hidden costs of sin. Um, Maybe some of the things that um, are concealed in the Christian tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that we as Christians don't think a lot about, but that are there nonetheless. Um, Again, as a way of talking about how the sacraments bring us out of isolation and into community, we do need to know the full geography of that isolation, because what happens is that the path out of isolation is built of taking the bits and recapitulating them with Christ, so that the error is like the solution uh, in reverse, right? So we need to know the geography from which we are departing, so that we can, um, in one sense, fully inhabit the solution. So let's talk about, um, we often think of sin as an issue of moral calculus, an issue of where you are going after you die, um, which, in a sense, is a hard thing, because while we are judging and while we are thinking about what becomes of us in the life after death, what we're also doing is messing up our relationship to our own psychology in this life, so that our own situation becomes a hell uh, that we currently inhabit, right? Um, so in one sense, sin is deeper than um, deeper than the kind of calculus that we're accustomed to doing, I think, as Christians. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's important. All right. We've talked a little bit about this, that our egos are a product of mishandling our wounded vulnerability. Um, we do eventually have to give up our egos, but we also have to um, sort of um, we also have to care for them, right? We have to care for our egos. So we are always doing two things: one, giving up self, and two, forming it, working with its wounds. Uh, they call it in the psychological world reparenting, um, which is a fabulous task to have to do, given that we have an image of God as Father. Um, it comes right out of the Christian God concept. This need to reparent the self, to form it. So we are reforming the self, recapitulating the self with Christ, and we are giving it up. All right. Um, let's take a look. Let's take a look at resentment and blame. Now, resentment is just re-feeling old emotion. Um, and of course, blame is not taking responsibility when you should take responsibility. Um, and I want to use this as a way of saying, in part, what sin does to psychology. It may not cause psychological problems. Sin is not the cause of psychological problems, but sin most certainly makes psychological problems worse. We create suffering for ourselves by the way we handle the situations we've been given. Let's talk, look at Genesis. Eve, even before the fall, misconstrues what God said. Um, God said, don't eat from the fruit of the tree at the center of the garden. When Satan asks Eve what God said, she says, God said, you shall not eat it, neither shall you touch it. Interesting, because God did not say, don't touch it. He said, don't eat of it. So we see Eve already taking God's words. This is before sin, right? Before sin. Taking God's words and selectively hearing, adding to things, right? Maybe not sinful, but certainly something that in light of sin becomes problematic. And then Adam has this wonderful thing where he names things. He names the animals, and that can be a wonderful thing that creates order. And in fact, a very beautiful thing, because he sees Eve and he says, this alone is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. It's this beautiful sort of poetry about how we are made for one another and made out of one another. It's lovely. So on the high end, his ability to name things is quite beautiful. But look what he does. As soon as sin happens, he sort of hot potatoes all the responsibility right over to Eve, and uses his ability to sort of name situations and name people to place blame, and it becomes very hard. Now let's talk about willfulness versus willingness. Sin makes us willful. We either want to run the show or we want to back away entirely, right? And neither are exactly what God wants of us. God wants us to be willing, not willful. When we're willing, we show up, we collaborate with other people, we play a part in the wider sort of task of communal living, but we don't determine what part we're going to play, nor do we determine ultimately the course of events. We're just there and we're trying to figure it out with other people. And it's not, see, when we are willful, there are little hits of adrenaline that are happening in our heads when we get our way, right? Look at how much control I have, we say to ourselves. When we are willing, we are participating, collaborating, running our lives not on the energy of adrenaline or on little hits of brain chemistry that we might be giving ourselves, but we are running on the energy of the spirit, which of course is sort of going up and down the spine as the angels went up and down Jacob's ladder in the dream. So two different forms of energy and two different forms of presence. Willfulness is running the show on adrenaline, and willingness is collaborating in the communal task on the energy of the spirit. Now, again, just to recap, sin makes us interact more with our thoughts about things than with the things themselves. We do construct an identity out of our thoughts, even when our thoughts about ourselves and other people are incorrect. And that kind of compulsive thinking puts itself between us and reality. We can't even really experience our five senses without living in reference more to the things that we think about than the actual sensations or feelings of our body. Let's talk about permanence, attachment, attraction, aversion. Permanence is mistakenly thinking we're perfect, powerful, and correct in the way we are. We knew we were naked in the garden, and the first thing that you see Adam and Eve do is make garments for themselves out of leaves, which in my mind is a symbol of the ego. It is a garment that you make for yourself to hide from God because you are reacting to your own vulnerability. So it's a great symbol for the ego, the garment of leaves. And behind that garment of leaves, we do a lot of blaming. We do a lot of resenting. And that just sort of drives our interactions with ourselves, our interactions with God, and our interactions with others. This myth of permanence, when in fact Jesus would say things like, "Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They don't toil or spin, yet God feeds them." So, like, we don't have to work as hard as we are working. And then, Jesus references the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire. We are just like the grass of the field. We're here for a while. We do what we do. And then we return to the Father from whom we came. And that's sort of the life cycle, right? And Jesus was not here to buck that. In fact, he submitted to it, especially in a painful way on the cross. So permanence is a lie to which impermanence is the solution. And we don't talk enough about how impermanence is deeply rooted in the preaching and teaching and life of Jesus. Let's talk about attachment. When we cooperate with compulsive thought, when we consistently evade the uncomfortable emotion, when we build habits of acting on compulsive thought, we develop coping skills, and those coping skills become habitual. What we do is we forget how to feel the vulnerability, right? Underneath it, we forget how to relax into the emotions that are involved in being vulnerable, right? And that forgetting, that willful forgetting, becomes an attachment. Let's talk about attraction. This is fun because, like, it's so predictable, right? We want more of what we like. And at the sort of on the worst end of it, we spiritualize wanting more of what we like. And we say that what we like is holy. And meanwhile, we push away what we don't like. Sometimes we spiritualize it by saying what we dislike is cursed. And this, this is in one sense neither here nor there, but the fact is, what we do is we end up judging everything around us based on whether we like it or don't. And then we push away half of life, and we get too graspy with half of life. And in the end, we're just sort of living partially instead of living wholly or entirely. And all of these, think about for all that Adam and Eve had at their disposal to eat. Um, think about what they had to reject, how many trees in the garden they had to reject to reach out in desire and grasp at the tree of knowledge. What are all of the things that they missed? Don't know. That's part of how attachment, attraction, aversion work, is they make us miss out on the wholeness of life because we are egotistically clinging to just a part of it. Let's talk about some of the pitfalls of the spiritual life. We like to think that God's love exempts us from loss. Again, this goes back to feeling permanent. Um, how much defensiveness do we waste so much energy being defensive because we don't want to lose the things that we have, whether that thing is an identity or whether that thing is material wealth or whether that thing is spiritual, like a spiritual narrative. I spent many years building a spiritual narrative about myself in the monastery, and it was a terrifying moment to let that spiritual narrative go. And yet, um, it was a way of embracing what I felt was a necessary growth of impermanence in my life. Jesus does not say, come and live forever without changing. He does say, you know, there is eternal life, but guess what? It's going to change form. It's all over the place, right? So we're not going to be exempt from loss, especially if we follow the teacher very closely. We are going to be, in fact, that loss is going to be accelerated in our lives. And it's going to cause a great deal of grief, but it's also going to be very freeing. So don't fall into the pitfall of saying that because we are redeemed by Jesus, we are exempt from loss. That is harmful and it's us creating suffering for ourselves. Why would we do that to ourselves? All right, spiritual bypassing. This was a concept created by, I believe it was Robert Augustus Masters, was the psychologist that noticed when spirituality has like pleasant bits, nice things to think about. It is nice to think about like the joys of heaven and the joys of following Jesus. And those are certainly there and they're substantial. But what happens is we cling to those joys and we ignore the bits in our psychology that are less than pleasant, again, because we are attached to the things we're attracted to, and we're pushing away the things that we are averse to. And that creates this movement of what Robert Augustus Masters called spiritual bypassing. You're using religion to end run around trauma, around your own shadow, around your darkness, whatever. It's a way of perpetuating denial and lack of conscious awareness. Let's talk about spiritual materialism. If you are a spiritual practitioner, this is particularly an interesting pitfall. It's possible to take the things that happen in a spiritual life and turn them into like spiritual merit badges almost that make you better than other people. I did this for 7 years. You're constantly saying, because of my spiritual like advancement, I am better than other people, and look at all those chumps. It's a form of vanity. And it creates two humanities, just like we talked about with the eight evil thoughts. It sets you against everybody else in the name of religion. So spiritual materialism is the use of consolations to make you better than others. And it's particularly gross because it's done in God's name. All right, entitlement is a hard one. We can often take the things that offend us and call them injustice so that in one sense, we don't have to face the fact that we don't have control. And in fact, we can get quite loud about how unjustly we are being punished for our sins, or our lack of sins. I mean, it's easy to take any need at all, and like turn it into a justice issue. So don't turn the needs of the ego into justice issues. That makes us entitled. We saw this during the pandemic when we were all sort of trying to keep each other safe, and there were people saying, I haven't had an appointment with my stylist in several years, and I just don't think it's fair that I should be restricted this way. Again, it's a hard thing not to have the finer things in life, but don't turn it into a justice issue. There are people who are the subject of much worse injustice, and let's maybe spend some of that righteous anger finding solidarity with those people. And I purposefully didn't say being angry on their behalf, because I don't think it's quite right to appropriate the indignation of a marginalized group. But we can search out the places in our own life where we can search out the places in our own life where we are feeling personally slighted, and we can accept it as opposed to turning it into a source of entitlement. So don't turn personal injustices or personal depravities into injustice to grasp at control. That's going to create suffering in our lives. It'll just make it worse. All right. Let's remember, marginalized people are a symptom. The problem is interior to each of us. First, we take parts of our own psyche and we push them down, right? And we do this for the purpose of surviving with other people. It's part of what sort of drives egotism, because only certain parts of ourselves are acceptable to the community. So we push down the things that are not acceptable to the community. And that relegates parts of our psyche to what's called our shadow, right? And when we do that inside of ourselves, we also end up subtly pushing against people that remind us of parts of ourselves that we don't like. I caught myself doing this with the disability community. I'm slightly disabled. And I caught myself sort of distancing myself from the disability community because I didn't want to look at that part of myself. So on the basis of a part of my shadow that I had repressed, I was othering other people. I was marginalizing the disability community. And again, it creates suffering. It creates two humanities where God created one. And it's a hard thing. It creates a lot of suffering. And it takes a lot of effort to enforce. which makes us all anxious. Now, there are only, if you want, sectors of society that rebel or sectors of society that don't fit in because of this thing that we do in ourselves where we judge and reject parts of ourselves. So the less we judge and reject parts of ourselves, the easier it's going to be able to allow all parts of society to just be who they are, right? It's in one sense, everybody we see in society, the judgmental churchy people, the weird fella who sits 3 pews over, that you're never quite comfortable around, like, and even, you know, the attractive, gracious, fabulous, spiritually motivated, those people in the congregation too. Those are all, they're all, if you want, expressions of different parts of us, right? We tend to have this thing that we do where we say, those people aren't me. And the fact is, they're all you. They're all you. They're all being given to you so you can do this work of familiarizing yourself with yourself. It's like Lectio Divina. The words are there so that you can read your reactions to them and what? And get to know your heart, become acquainted with your heart. Same thing with the community. They are here so that we can get to know our heart. So let's use them for the mirror of compassion that they are intended to be. Now, remember, there's a very purposeful thing Jesus did. He became everything we reject and ignore. Jesus made himself literally present in the Eucharist. He said, "This is my body." All right. He also made himself literally present in many of the kinds of groups that we reject and ignore in society. He became the stranger. He became the hungry. He became the poor. He became the naked. Also that, like, I'm an introvert, like, and I don't like strangers. When people are strangers, it's an uncomfortable thing for me. But guess what? That's why Jesus put himself there, so that when I went into something that I'm uncomfortable with, I would do this whole thing where eventually I found Jesus. He's taking our aversions, the hardest bits that we have to see God in, and he's just gradually working with it until the ego dies in that spot and something humbler rises. And that something humbler is the image of God and the image of Christ inside of us. Jesus died in the worst possible way. It's like all the things that are bad in our life are still within the purview of the things Jesus accepted. There's nothing that Jesus did not embrace and habit and become to help us to awaken to the fact that both in our attractions and in our aversions, definitely in the impermanence of our identity, Jesus is literally present. Jesus descended into hell. He literally, as St. Paul said, he became sin. And, you know, his dying and rising, etc., his going within each of his disciples that I believe he did at the Ascension, all of that was a way of saying that the death, the aversion, the shadow, it's not the end of the story. but it is the thing that you have to embrace for the story to begin. Let's talk for a minute about 12-steppers, 12-step groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, and all of the sort of break-off groups from that. They say religion is for those who fear hell. Spirituality is for those who have been there. Again, to have freely made my life a hell by my interaction with compulsive thinking, with compulsive action, with ignoring an uncomfortable emotion, to have freely made my life a hell is something that when it's faced, well, like that's the journey. That's the hero's journey, to face the things that I have made into a hell by the way that I have or have not been conscious of them. To die to self, to give up self in descending into that hell, and to rise as something new, something hopefully humbler. So Jesus became all the things we're averse to, period. All right. And really, like, we need to talk a little bit about grief and shadow work. Grief over the dying of the false self really has to become a discipline like prayer, because it's happening, the dying of the false self. It's happening every time you have to wait longer at a stoplight than you would like to, when you're, 5 minutes late to begin with, and here you are stuck at a stoplight. Or, when you're in the grocery store and you're behind the person who's walking slow, that's a dying of self. When you are sitting at home with a spouse who, plain and simple, wants a different form of, takeout cuisine than you do. That's every bit of these little tiny adjustments, they cause a certain amount of death to the ego, right? And even in small ways, there's little bits of grief that need to be done. Differences are a source of grief. That grief isn't necessarily unhealthy, but it's a thing that needs to be paid attention to and done consciously in order for us to turn it into something life-giving. We do need to work with our tendency toward willful denial. We do need to assume that we are relegating parts of ourselves to the psyche, not to the psyche, but to the shadow. We're relegating parts of our psyche to the shadow. And why that's important, why it's important to ongoingly do shadow work, is because if we do not face those things, they will reach up and kind of grab us, right? Unawares and by surprise, just like elements of society that rebel. If we push people down, they will rise up and rebel eventually, right? We need to, in one sense, become cuddly with the assumption that we are, and it's just a thing that psyches do. It's not we're not bad because we relegate things to shadow, but we do it. And it's important work to let that whole thing go down consciously. We need to assume we're relegating things to our shadow. We need to assume that we are consciously ignoring our brokenness. And that assumption, when we become cuddly with the fact that we are slightly evasive basically all the time, it starts to fuel this constant journey of going deeper, because we want to be aware, right? We want to be as healthy as we can. and we want to take responsibility and not shirk any of the work. It's all of this. We want to be as aware as possible. We want to be as conscious as possible. Why? Because we want to be serene. And the only way to be serene is to do all the work and to not ignore the things. Yeah. So now, when we do the grieving, when we do the shadow work, when we remember our own tendency to repress parts of ourselves to function in society, this really deprives judgment of its power. When my students, because students have a great way of being very, very interesting at times. When my students would say, "Mr. Warner, you're a terrible teacher," I would say, "That's true. I am occasionally a terrible teacher, but 100% of the time, I'm also a little ugly." And that would diffuse the situation. Because it's like, I know that about myself. Here's a couple things you missed. Now let's move on. Someone who didn't know that there were ways that they were terrible would spend so much time rejecting their own terribleness that would have been a different conversation, right? And it would have diffused slower. So knowing our shadow, knowing our sinfulness deprives judgment of its power. And there's a beauty to, in one sense, the gallows humor. It's like, well, if you've already made your life a hell, then the only way you can go is up, right? The only thing things can do is get better. As long as you remember that you could definitely make things worse, the only thing that can happen is it can get better. And it's beautiful to watch a room full of people in recovery just like mercilessly mock themselves, and everybody laughs, right? Because they all get it. There's a communal, why did we do this, and isn't it funny, that's kind of wonderful. It's a beautiful part of knowing ourselves completely enough to employ that there gallows humor. So again, like, let's talk just a little bit before we end about the fact that underneath moral calculus, underneath are we going to heaven or hell, there is a, what are you making your present moment into, and what are you making your own psyche into by ignoring things, by pushing things down, and then what does spiritual life look like when always, in one sense, you are dying? There's a false self that is dying all the time, even as the truth itself is being born. How does that change the Christianity that you live yourself and peddle to others? And then, you know, the question is like, how does it change Christianity when part of yourself is something that you are pushing down, and, well, it makes a bunch of compulsive thought and action come out sideways all over the place, and guess what? We make our lives into a hell because we are being constantly psychologically repressive. And then when you project that societally, it means that disabled people, LGBTQIA people, they're all marginalized. Why? Because we can't deal with ourselves, right? And So it's again, what we're trying to map out is in one sense the geography of living comfortably in our own skin, which does not consist of the compulsive thought that isolates us. Living comfortably in our own skin deals with the deliberateness and the serenity to sit still. And that's what we're going to talk about eventually is how to take the compulsive thought that isolates us, replace it with the deliberate thought that brings us into community, and that the whole journey from compulsive thought to deliberate thought is made sacred in the sacraments. Anyway, tune in next time for more. Thank you for joining us, and be at peace.